Good evening, everyone. My name is Marty Leonard, and I am the Acting Dean of Science here at Dalhousie, and I want to welcome you all on behalf of Dalhousie and also the Faculty of Science to the first, well, I'll say inaugural Ransom A. Myers Lecture in Science and Society. It's a pleasure to have you here. Last spring, a number of Ram's friends and colleagues, and Rita, his beloved wife, came together to think of a way to honor Ram's memory. And we decided that probably the very best way was to have a public lecture that was covered science and the world at large. And so it was what we decided to do, and we're delighted that you're here. And what I'm going to do now is turn the microphone over to, again, a close friend and colleague of Ram's, Dr. Jeff Hutchings, who's going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Marty. First of all, welcome again, to reiterate the Acting Dean's welcome. As my initial task, I want to acknowledge and offer sincere thanks to the sponsors of this evening's lecture, Dr. Tom Travis, the President of Dalhousie University, the Department of Mathematics and Statistics, and the Department of Biology. I'd also like to acknowledge Derek Tittensor and Gillian Boyce for their extremely fine artistic contributions to the poster and postcards used to advertise this evening's lecture. As Marty says, this is the first of what will be an annual lecture series at Dalhousie, and the idea of establishing the series originated with friends, students, family of Rams who wish to identify an appropriate means of honoring our collective memories of Ram and of commemorating his contributions to science. But in addition to inviting internationally renowned scientists to Dalhousie, we wanted the lecture series to provide a means of linking science with the myriad ways in which science affects us and the societies in which we live. By influencing things such as government policy, public opinion, and individual behavior, science is ever increasingly interwoven into the fabric of who we are, what we are, how we live, and how we interact with one another and with our environment. Ram's recognition of the importance of the communication of science to society had its origins, I think, in the collapse of Newfoundland's Atlantic cod fishery in 1992. At the time, he and I were analyzing the reasons for the collapse of the fishery and prospects for the recovery of cod, and we were profoundly affected by the emotional, socioeconomic, and ecological scars produced by that collapse, scars that have yet to heal 16 years later. I first met Ram in 1983, shortly after he had defended his doctoral thesis here at Dalhousie, and just after he had taken up a position as a research scientist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in St. John's, Newfoundland. He and I published our first paper together in 1985, and we will co-author our final paper in 2009. So it is an honor for me to be here to contribute, albeit modestly, to a lecture series in the name of my colleague and friend. It is an honor dulled only by the realization that he isn't physically here to enjoy it. But that wasn't the case in 1983. Ram's enthusiasm for science was akin to a puppy's enthusiasm for life. During our initial years together, Ram spoke regularly and highly of three individuals here at Dalhousie. His supervisor, Roger Doyle, was described as the expert in quantitative genetics. Christophe Herbinger, a fellow grad student and now faculty member in the biology department, was the expert in salmon. And another grad student, Andy Rosenberg, was the expert in fisheries science. So it is highly appropriate then that a member of this Dalhousie trinity of Ram's most respected colleagues at the time is our inaugural lecture speaker. Following completion of his PhD in biology in 1984, Andy spent 6 years in London, 2 as a postdoctoral fellow under the auspices of John Beddington, and 4 as a lecturer at Imperial College. In 1990, he returned to the U.S., taking a chief administrative position with the National Marine Fisheries Service in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Thereafter began what can only be described as a meteoric rise up the administrative ladder, first reaching the post of regional administrator for federal fisheries in the northeastern U.S., before attaining the position of deputy director for all of the National Marine Fisheries Service throughout the United States. So for 2 years, he was responsible for a federal agency that had almost 3,000 employees and a budget of more than $500 million. But a return to academic life beckoned at the University of New Hampshire, and he answered the call by taking up the position of Dean at the College of Life Sciences and Agriculture. And since stepping down as Dean in 2004, he's been able to allocate greater amounts of time to his research on ecosystem-based management, ocean policy, historical ecology, and fisheries management. Among the many reflections of his considerable expertise, he has served on numerous expert panels and advisory committees, 2 of which were based on presidential appointments. He has spoken before the U.S. House of Representatives. He presented the inaugural Ocean Lecture in honor of Dalhousie's Elizabeth Mann Borghese, and he was named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for his societal contributions of science. To conclude then, in addition to being one of RAM's closest friends, Andy's research excellence and combination of academic and administrative experience make him uniquely qualified to present the inaugural lecture of the Ransom A. Myers Lecture Series in Science and Society entitled The Future of Fisheries, Science, Policy, and Societal Challenges. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosenberg.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for a wonderful introduction. I'm not sure about the meteoric rise. Sometimes going into fisheries is not considered a rise, but might be in the other direction. But I do appreciate the kind words. And this is really a great honor for me to honor my friend and colleague and a man who taught me a lot, Ram Myers, but also to see so many people that I've learned from over the years and admired their own work, and to come back to Dalhousie, a place that I really care about. And I have to say, before I start into the lecture itself, that as I was walking up to meet with Heike Lotz and Boris Worm today, I was walking up through the university, and I realized I was walking up faster and faster. And then I realized going through my head was, I better get in, I gotta finish my thesis, I gotta finish my thesis, I gotta finish my thesis. Then I realized, wait a minute, I did that. So for the graduate students who are here, it doesn't go away. Well, I'm going to talk about the future of fisheries, and I have had the opportunity to move back and forth between the policy worlds and the science worlds in fisheries. And now in my own work remain with sometimes a foot or at least some part of my body in each one. I still do some policy work, and I still try to do some science, working with my students and with many colleagues, including those here at Dalhousie around the world. And I want to try to describe for you a perspective on what I think might happen in fisheries with a little bit of history on what has happened, and I'll move fairly quickly through that. This isn't an academic seminar in the usual sense, so you'll forgive me if I move through fairly quickly to describe some of the history. But I really want to focus on where things might change, or where I think things have to change in order to do a better job than we have in the past. And I start with this picture from the coast of Maine. I'm not in it. But it would not be atypical of some of the management meetings that I have had the pleasure of attending. Jeff mentioned that I was on some governmental commissions, including one called the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, which was an extraordinary opportunity. And it completed the work in 2004, and I was being interviewed after the commission meetings. And the reporters said, to me, and this is apropos of the age of the people in this slide, I understand this is the first commission in the U.S. to look at comprehensively at ocean policy since 1970 or the 1960s, completing in 1970 the Stratton Commission. And I said, yes, that's correct. And he said, were you on that commission as well? And I said, well, I was 12 at the time, and my dad wouldn't let me, but they did ask me. And the reporter said, really? And I said, now, this was a telephone interview, I have to admit. So sometimes it feels like we're going back in time in fisheries policy and management and in ocean policy in general. I hope that's not true. We should think about Ram Myers, and I'm not going to tell anecdotes of Ram because my voice won't stand it. But I did have another, before I talk a little bit about his work very quickly, and that was as I walked into the Life Science building, I remembered that windowless room across the hall from where, on the 7th floor, or down the hall from where Roger sat, which used to have 2 computer terminals in it, and I spent some maybe 10 billion hours in there with Ram at one terminal and me at the other. The last part of that with his first child in his lap, usually screaming bitterly, which is what I wanted to do, as we both tried to write our theses on those line editors for the terminals. And of course, Ram was talking and thinking about 10 other things while he was writing his thesis and taking care of his child. And it, you know, while it was astonishingly excruciating at times, it was also a remarkable experience to hear all of the things that he could think of and do at once. And if you walk through the Life Science building now, you'll see this incredible range of papers going up the stairway of his productivity. And I'm going to talk about very, very briefly about a few of them, and this is the one that he and Roger did, worked on together for his dissertation on predicting natural mortality rates by thinking about life history of fish and taking a very novel approach by looking at evolutionary stable strategies and then inversely optimizing to what the natural mortality rate was. Now, that's a really, really hard problem, even if you did understand all the pieces, and I'm not sure that I did. But the thing that I realized when I started to look back at these papers is that Ram was a brilliant analyst, as I think we will all recognize, but he also was a brilliant asker of questions. I think he got some of that from Roger, but he was a brilliant asker of questions. And so as I looked through some of the papers, you look at the titles of his papers, and I'm not going to talk about the details of each one, but is fish recruitment related to spawner abundance? He wanted to know that because people would question, does it really matter if we fish down a fish stock? And some people astonishingly would say, well, maybe not, because there's no real relationship between how many spawners there are and how many progeny they produce. Well, of course there is, but Ram wanted to demonstrate it. And then came another characteristic line from Ram Myers. Let's find all the data in the world that can examine this question. And he wasn't kidding. And so some people now, some of his students and postdocs are still trying to find all the data in the world to answer that brilliant question. It wasn't a question that hadn't been asked before, but it wasn't a question that anybody had directly tried to answer before in the same way that Ram did. We searched for thresholds for overfishing, particularly recruitment overfishing that would hinder the ability of a population to sustain itself because of reducing recruitment. Ram asked with Jeff and with Nick Barrowman, why do fish stocks collapse? And even in the titles of his papers, he was asking questions that mattered. They mattered scientifically. They mattered certainly as a matter of policy. But he could focus on that question that made the most difference in these fisheries situations. And I guess I should say that I'm going to talk about a little bit in this very quick overview of Ram's work in fisheries, but we need to remember that he did work in a lot of other areas too. He did work in population genetics, he did some work in biological oceanography, he did some work in population dynamics for other kinds of stocks, he did work with endangered species and so on. When do environment and recruitment correlations work? A question that apparently somebody doesn't like, had not been clearly articulated, and it wasn't just that he could articulate the question, but he'd say, well, if we ask this question, how would you go about analyzing the existing data? And again, let's go find all the data in the world to answer a question. I have no idea if that's me, but I apologize if it is. It's probably Ram knocking on the microphone saying, wait a minute, that's not what I meant. He was good at that in seminars, some of us will remember. What's the carrying capacity for fish in the ocean? Probably a central and focused question that again, people have not articulated nearly as well as Ram did. And if I think then about how policy develops, all of these questions are the things you want to know if you think through the science to policy interface. Well, a famous paper that Ram and Boris Worm produced in 2003 tried to address a question of how depleted are the fish stocks of the world. Again, asking those critical questions, and this was and still is a very controversial paper, the answer being, in most of the ecosystems of the world, if you look at broad pattern, you have substantial depletion. And there was enormous outcry. This can't be right. I realized after a little while, and I, read the paper and had some questions about methodology and about results, and it seemed to me that most of the objections went something like this. Well, I know a fish stock where that's not true, which is almost certainly everyone can find such a fish stock where it's not true that they were depleted to 10% of their original abundance. Ram, in his fulsome way, would say, so what? That's not what the paper was about. The paper was, what's the general pattern? Can we extract general pattern from a very broad set of data? And interestingly enough, these arguments about how depleted fish stocks went on over several papers like this, all of which had an entirely different databases, and all of which came up with a similar result. This one from Billy Christensen and Daniel Pauly and Reg Watson, Carl Walters at UBC, which said, well, if we estimate the biomass of predatory fish, those fish that eat other fish, back in time to 1900, and I'm not going to spend time describing how you do that, and then we look at that same plot. I have to figure out how to go back up. Where the red bars are higher abundance of fish and the cool colors are lower abundance of fish. And then we look at that same plot in 2000, you see a large-scale depletion of those predatory fish in the ocean. Well, if you look at these kinds of graphs, you get a similar result, but the data is entirely separate. The method of analysis is entirely separate. The result is essentially independent of the analysis, and you get confirmatory information from other data, as you do from many other methods. So Ram's question about how depleted was not only a good one, but could be confirmed even though it was highly controversial. It's widely cited, but within the fisheries community, there's been a circling of the wagons to say, no, that result can't be right. Sometimes that's because people know that individual fish stock where it's not true, and sometimes that's because people are afraid that means they haven't done their jobs. The history of fishing, actually, is expansion to new areas and fishing methods and products, and generally resulting in massive overexploitation serially of each of those resources as you go, and overexploitation of the marine ecosystems upon which they depend. Now, it is certainly true that all fish stocks have not been depleted down to 10% of their initial level. Some have been depleted far more than that, and some less. It's certainly not true that all stocks in the world are overfished. But the broad pattern is this one, that in fact the continued expansion, improvement in methodology, and increase in product lines has resulted in massive overexploitation. From some of my own work related to RAMs, if you look at the biomass of cod, adult cod, on the Scotian shelf, and you use historical data, which I've had the good fortune to do with some historians at University of New Hampshire, then you can estimate the abundance of cod in 1850. And that's the green dot on this graph. I don't think I can really effectively use a pointer, so I'm not going to try. I'd note that the dashed line, the black dashed line, is an estimate that RAM made about what's the carrying capacity for cod. And Brian, you were on that study too, Brian McKenzie, who's here. What's the carrying capacity of cod on the Scotian shelf? And it falls within the confidence limits from our estimate based on logbook data from the 1850s and 60s. And the answer was 1.2 million metric tons of cod, and it's almost certainly an underestimate of the actual amount of cod because we couldn't account for the inshore fishery. On the right-hand side of the graph, the red and brown lines are the recent estimates from DFO up until the early part, about 2001 or 2002, of the total biomass of cod. And in fact, Our estimate for the 1850s was really only of the older cod, those greater than age 5, certainly. And you can see the distance between those. Now this, again, is entirely separate data, entirely different methodology, but comes up with an answer of we're down to 2 or 3% of that initial abundance. So while many questioned Ram and Boris's result, if you look at it in different ways, you come up with very similar answers. The overexploitation of stocks or shifts in the ecosystem have resulted in a very much lower abundance. And of course, some of that clearly is exploitation, because we know the average size of the fish is very much smaller now than it was then. And that's an indication of the mortality rates that are incumbent upon the stocks. We've seen that shift back even in the beginning of the 20th century with the fishery out of New England, where I live, as the fishery moved offshore in search of new products and new fishing grounds. And in fact, in the Gulf of Maine, while we can't yet estimate the biomass, we've recently found that the estimated Gulf of Maine catch was 78,000 metric tons in 1861 from sailing vessels fishing with hooks over the side before they used dories and long lines. The current catch, as you see there, is about 3,500 metric tons from the mechanized fleet. And I would assure you that's not because of regulatory restrictions. The catch is that low because that's what you can catch. Of course, they could catch more if they were allowed to fish out the stock. The current fleet was allowed to fish out the stock altogether. In fact, just a few vessels out of Frenchman's Bay could catch almost 3 times the amount that the mechanized fleet can catch for the entire Gulf of Maine currently. So we know that the abundance was very much higher back in the 19th century. Maybe that's not a surprise, but you have to ask some questions, as Ram would, about those numbers and about the numbers on the Scotian Shelf. For example, if there was 1.2 million metric tons of cod on the Scotian Shelf, what were they eating? Right now, that's a huge biomass compared to the current biomass. So what were they eating? What did the ecosystem look like? If there was 500,000 metric tons in the Gulf of Maine, what was the food base for that resource? And 500,000 tons would not be an unreasonable number for a catch of about 80,000 tons by the sailing fleet then. Here's the pattern for cod landings, and again, it looks remarkably similar to some of the patterns that we've seen from Ram's information. Even the heyday of the fishery in the 70s and 80s is tiny compared to those catches that I indicated for the 1850s. And this is again in the Gulf of Maine, not the Scotian Shelf. We also know that over historical time, fisheries and other causes, but certainly in large part fisheries, have changed the composition of the ecosystem, the fishery ecosystem, in the Gulf of Maine and in many other areas. And this is a measure of the trophic level, the place in the food web for various species. If you look at the average trophic level across the catch statistics in the Gulf of Maine for 100 years, you see a steady decline to species that are lower and lower in the food web. Now, it is true that landings aren't necessarily reflective of a population, but they give you some indication of what was available to the fishery, particularly keeping in mind that the fishery was unregulated for all but the last few years of this, last couple of decades of this long time series. So some fundamental ecosystem changes have occurred, at least in part, if not in major part, due to the fishery. Well, in a review by the National Academy of Sciences in the US, looking across the literature, there clearly is evidence of large declines in overall abundance for many stocks of fish globally, and certainly off of North America. And we know that fisheries can affect the structure of ecosystems. And that effect can be at all levels. It can be habitat impacts as well as removal of top predators, which was the point of that paper that by Myers and Worm. We know that changes in fishery ecosystem can be caused by physical forcing or climate effects, for example. But we also know that they can be caused by fishing, and there's well-documented cases where that has occurred. A so-called regime shift where you get a very different system. And of course, we have one of those off the northeast shelf, certainly off of Newfoundland with regard to shifts to lower trophic levels with the overharvesting of cod that Jeff referred to, as well as in the Gulf of Maine for the shelf ecosystem. But our perceptions of what an ecosystem looks like under light exploitation change. So in the Gulf of Maine, it's very clear, or on the Scotian Shelf, or in Newfoundland, it's very clear that people's thoughts about what a healthy fish stock is changes over time. Some of that change occurs because you continually observe, as you fish down a resource, you can get more and more data points at low abundance levels, and you start to think that's the only possibility there. And in fact, in many of the conventional ways to analyze the data, that is the result that you would get. The so-called reference points that people use to manage fisheries often will decline if you continue to observe the stock at low levels because overfishing has occurred. The stock is at a low level because of overfishing. You make many observations, which fisheries scientists often call probing the origin. In other words, you get as close to zero as you can, and your perception is that's probably the best a stock can do. So when you start to implement management measures to rebuild a resource, it often is the case that people's perspective on what could be a rebuilt resource is dramatically altered. And that's been coined, again, by Daniel Pauly as a shifting baseline syndrome, where people will only think that what is possible is what they've observed in their lifetime or their experience on the water. My anecdote about that is a colleague of mine, Brad Brown, was at a fisheries management meeting and was being taken to task by a fisherman in the tuna fishery who said, there's more tuna out there than I've ever seen in my life. And Brad looked at him and said, yeah, but you're not very old. And he said, what do you mean? I'm 26. I've been doing this for, 6 years. And, Brad said, well, a 6-year-old tuna wouldn't be a very old tuna either. The perception of what can exist is often colored by your recent observations. And that's true both in the science as well as in anecdotal observations. Amazingly enough, the National Academy report stated, even though there was some people on the panel who really adamantly opposed, for example, the Myers and Worm analysis and some others, Daniel Pauly's analysis, the panel agreed that we might be reaching the theoretical limit of productivity that we can extract from the ocean, from exploited uses. And that's a remarkable statement. It's a statement about the food security that we are facing with regard to one of the highest quality, the most important sources of high quality protein that there is globally, that we are reaching a theoretical limit of what we can take in capture fisheries. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no hope for fisheries or that the end of capture fisheries is in sight or that the oceans will be completely depleted of all food fish species or any of those things. It doesn't mean that all stocks are overfished, and it doesn't mean that all ecosystems have collapsed. It does mean that we need to adapt both our management and our fishing strategies in order to do a better job of utilizing the resources that are available to us. And we know that a number of things will change. Well, we have lost abundance, and we have lost, in many cases, biodiversity, and I would say many other things such as habitat diversity. But we also know that there are changes coming in distribution of species, in productivity of ecosystems, species composition certainly, in variability and in resilience of those ecosystems for lots of reasons, not the least of which is climate change, of course. But those changes occur not only due to climate change, but due to habitat loss, due to changing human activities, and so on. And so we can lament the changes or we can figure out some way to adapt to them. And the fact that you have to make some adaptation tells you something about the policy that you need to work with as well. Some of the lessons that I think we have learned from Ram's work as a major body of work in understanding how fisheries populations and fishery ecosystems work, and others. Sorry. Is that we should be very wary of making a dichotomy between environmental changes and fishing effects. Remember that question, how do you evaluate environment and fishery correlations? Well, it's rarely the case that fishery effects and environmental changes are at right angles to each other or don't interact. And so to try to decide which one is most important is probably not a very useful exercise. We certainly know that both affect resources and the potential productivity that you could harvest sustainably from resources. There's a very long-standing argument in fisheries about stocks such as Pacific sardines or Peruvian anchoveta that goes something like this. Well, it really was El Nino that resulted in the collapse of the stock. No, it was really the fishery that resulted in the collapse of the stock. Well, from one perspective, you could say, of course, both were operating, but think of it from a policy perspective. So if there was an environmental change that meant that the productivity of the resource was reduced, and you were managing for a sustainable fishery, then the message should be that you reduce the harvest rate. And if you had depleted the stock such that recruitment overfishing was occurring, then the policy prescription for that is you should reduce the harvest rate. So I never really could understand why we were arguing about that, because the end result should be the same regardless of which of those it was. Now, if they were antagonistic, in other words, you had declining environment, but you really had a release from fishing pressure, then you still might be in a situation of reducing the harvest rate, or you might be able to hold steady. But in no case would you say, well, it's the one that's most important that I need to pay attention to and I should ignore the other. I don't need to worry about fishing effects because an environmental change has occurred. But in the policy discussions, it seems sometimes to be a question of, can we assign blame as opposed to can we figure out what to do next? And that will actually not work, because I'm not sure that the fish really care about who's to blame. You're thinking of a biological population that will do what it will do. As species compositions, ranges, and productivity shift, fisheries will adapt to those changes incredibly rapidly. That's the history of fisheries. It's not a problem of fishing pressure moving to adapt to species composition changes. It's a question of whether you can adapt the management to those changes. So you have very rapid changes that occur into new fishery areas. Probably the simplest example right now is fisheries that are developing and actually collapsing fish stocks on seamounts within just a few years, because they're very low productivity stocks, and now there's gear that can reach down and access those resources in very, very deep water, and some species aggregate around seamounts. And so there have been seamount areas that have been fished out in, I think the number is about 5 years, because of the ability to access, to get to those places, to locate the resource and to get it to market, which didn't exist 30 years ago. So you're seeing depletion of stocks like orange roughy and dory fisheries and so on very, very rapidly. So we know the fisheries will adapt. Is it possible for management to keep up? Well, one possibility is management can do what it has done for a long time, and I'll show you some examples of reducing the flexibility to move to other resources. And so that means that a management will try to catch up. And think about whether that's actually a likely scenario that management will be able to adapt as quickly as fishermen will be able to adapt. And I would say, no, it's not possible. And it's not because managers are dumb and fishermen are smart, although some people might argue that, or the other way around. It's just that you're trying to catch up to an event that's always going to precede you. You're not going to manage it in advance, unfortunately, under current systems. And finally, if fisheries are very flexible, then the fact that you have overcapacity in fisheries, that you have much more harvesting capacity than you do resource to sustain that harvesting capacity, means that overcapacity becomes intolerable if it can move around. That excess harvesting capacity, if it can move, will always result in overfishing in the next place. And so overcapacity becomes not only a local issue, but a global issue. Sorry, it wasn't finally. it's ecosystems that undergo changes, not just the individual stocks. So it's not sufficient to go in and say, well, we'll take care of the orange roughy on a seamount. You actually do have to think about what's going to happen to an ecosystem broadly. And ecosystem plans are going to have to change almost as rapidly as fishery management plans because of the capacity of vessels to move from one place to the other. If you push the exploitation for each species, one after the other, to its limits, that has to be an incredibly risky strategy if you care about what remains in the ocean for another generation. It has to be risky because it's hard to imagine a circumstance where you could push everything to its limit of exploitation with a high amount of fishing pressure, and the result will be that the system will just be okay without any consequences. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. And I realize it's Friday night, so what you really wanted to do is look at a lot of graphs. But so Georges Bank cod is one example of this, and has been a long discussion about why haven't Georges Bank cod recovered. Well, the red line here is a measure of the exploitation rate for Georges Bank cod, and the blue line is a measure of the spawning biomass or the abundance of cod in the sea. And the dashed red line is where we believe the maximum sustainable yield rate is, or the sustainable harvest rate. So the red line should be down below the red dashed line. And this stock has been under a recovery plan since 1995, arguably 1996, depending on when you decide the plan starts. The problem is that we've been overfishing it for that entire period. And so people say, well, why hasn't it recovered? Well, it's because even though you have a plan in place, apparently the fish didn't read the plan and realize they're supposed to live even though we are fishing them. And so it's a simple answer that because we are continuing to overfish cod, it hasn't actually recovered. Well, why hasn't it recovered? Well, it's because in the New England fishery, and to a lesser extent actually in the Canadian fishery, the management strategy has been to try to reduce the flexibility of every fisherman out there so that they can only do one or two things in many cases. And there's not much opportunity to move, or for the limited opportunity you have, you're going to maximize dollars at the time, and the maximum dollars would be cod. So why would a fisherman move off of cod, even if we would like the exploitation rate to be lower? They're not going to. If you actually look what's happened to the spawning biomass, then it's just continued to decline with a little bit of an uptick at the end, because we're probably coming down to the point where there is no more flexibility for people to stay on cod, and there's some other opportunity out there where there's finally a recognition to move people off onto stocks that are doing better, like haddock. I'm actually going to skip the Gulf of St. Lawrence because you know more about it than I do. In the North Sea, you see an extreme example of that, in my opinion, and that is there's been an endless series of recovery plans, but almost no change in the red line, the exploitation rate, and an almost continual decline in the spawning biomass for this stock. These discussions are something like, well, here's the recommended harvest level. In fact, that's probably the next slide. The biological advice is, well, you really shouldn't catch cod anymore. So that biological advice then goes before a council of ministers, but to protect the industry, you have to allow some flexibility still in the fishery, and therefore you're going to set a positive quota on cod, and because it's worth more and more money as it becomes less and less available, that's where you're going to use all of your available time if you can, unless you decide in a short period of time that there's something that's slightly more valuable. In other words, you're endlessly playing this game of catch-up. The managers will back off because it's so very difficult to say, well, no, we're actually not going to catch any cod this year in a fishery that's existed for a very long time in the North Sea. This is from Paul Denbowl, and as I'll describe in a minute, he will refer to this as the sort of death spiral of fisheries, where management tries to catch up slowly and fishermen adapt quickly, and you're never really going to catch up in that circumstance. Well, why does management adapt slowly? Well, because political pressure is going to say, no, you can't do this to me, just give me a few more years. This is one of my favorite pictures. I probably use it in every talk. It's a demonstration in Gloucester Harbor, where I live, when I was actually Deputy Director of Fisheries, not Regional Administrator. Along the front, the people standing there are some fishermen, but also local officials and representatives of every political official that was concerned with the town of Gloucester, both federal and state, as well as the mayor, who's right down front. And these are boats protesting against the limits in the cod fishery in particular. And there's two people that if I can do this. So I'm actually in the picture, that's me, and that is my colleague Pat Kirkle. And so I'm kind of proud of that, I like this picture. It's essentially saying, no, these restrictions are too much for us to bear, just slow them down. Slow them down, and that's why you see management not responding, because to resist that kind of political pressure is nearly impossible unless you can get an extremely strong legal mandate to do so. Well, as Paul Denbol would say, technical regulations are countered by adaptations, to neutralize economic impact, and that results in this micromanagement spiral or death spiral for most fisheries. So you change the gear a little bit, you change the inputs a little bit more, maybe you change the outputs, but fishermen are always going to adapt much more quickly than managers will. The only way you can get around that is to change it to a model where you're evaluating the result as opposed to just the inputs, so that you're not trying to catch up in terms of what's the innovation that's occurring. You're simply saying, I don't really care how you innovate, but here's a specification of the result. And that's now occurred to a large extent in the changes in US law that have happened this last year, by stating that you have to specify what the result is for every management plan, and that result must meet a standard of no overfishing and minimizing bycatch and a number of other things, so-called annual catch limits provisions. It seems an obvious thing to do, but very difficult to get through a political process, to have that as a hard standard, that somebody can go to court and say, hey, wait a minute, you didn't meet that standard. You allowed the fishermen more flexibility. That flexibility will endlessly outrace you. Well, it's pretty clear if fishing pressure remains high, stocks show little recovery, and I've just shown you that, but it's also very clear that for some stocks, and we don't need to go through these three, if you reduce fishing pressure, you get the expected result. Stocks will recover as long as you haven't depleted them to an incredibly low level. So sometimes people will say, well, yeah, but that didn't happen for northern cod because there's been a moratorium on northern cod. We don't fish that stock anymore. Well, that's actually not true. There's all kinds of windows for flexibility for northern cod that mean actually the harvest rate has been maintained higher than the stock can sustain for quite a long time. I'm not quite sure why these lights keep changing. Did I do something wrong, Ram? Anyway. The incentive system for most fisheries is essentially to try to challenge fishermen to push the limits as far as they possibly can. They're not doing anything wrong. It's not because fishermen are doing something wrong, evil, or inappropriate. But the way that the management plans are structured mean that you should see how far you can push the regulations. And ultimately, fishermen are really good at this. They're going to figure out a way to push the regulations to their limit, and in many cases that will be more than a stock can sustain. Well, that's not going to work. So, as Paul Denbol would say, as Ray Hilborn would say, as I would certainly say, you have to change that incentive structure such that the incentive is to make the conservation requirements work, or meet the conservation needs, as opposed to see how far you can stretch the limits. Well, how would you do that? Well, one way you would do it is to link the access to the resource to the creativity of staying within those conservation limits. If the output is to be a certain level, if we know the result is to be a certain level, try to get the creativity that fishermen can bring to all their operations, which will always be much greater than a manager's creativity about fishing operations. Make that creativity work towards conservation as opposed to simply work towards stretching the rules as far as you can. Fishing doesn't exist in isolation, and so you can create the pressure to to make that kind of system, but you also have to put fishermen into a logical position where they gain something from actually making the conservation work as opposed to just lose. It's not going to work if you simply say, we'll do this because we'd like you to for the good of society, and I'm not really concerned about your income. You have to be concerned about income because that's why people do it. One of the ways to do that is to try to change policies such that you look at a whole set of impacts, not just the impacts of fishing. I'm going to skip the cat shares piece. Well, maybe I won't. So a recent paper has demonstrated empirically, much in the tradition that Ram pioneered, that if you give shares of the catch for stewardship to an individual fisherman or a group of fishermen, and that's a condition of participating in the fishery, then the percent of stocks that have actually collapsed is quite substantially reduced. So if this is a means of changing the incentive structure, giving somebody a long-term opportunity to participate in the fishery and making their participation contingent upon staying within the rules. You know, I worked for a while as the manager for the squid fishery in the Falkland Islands, which sounds like a strange place to work, and it is a little bit, but it's the largest squid fishery in the world, and it's worth $1 billion a year, so it's not all that strange. And there was no domestic constituency because nobody in the Falkland Islands goes fishing. It's an all foreign fleet, and you can do whatever you like in terms of the rules and the requirements. And remarkably, by linking access to the fishery to providing detailed data on a daily basis electronically, ensuring that there weren't any vessels that were fishing outside the limits, even though you had a relatively small ability to catch a vessel, and restricting actually the number of vessels very severely, we got a very high level of compliance. And I know that because we caught a vessel once who was fishing illegally in the zone, and the penalties were we imprisoned the captain and impounded the boat and took away the catch and told the company that we were not going to consider them for any licenses in future years, and these boats were making $1 million in 6 weeks. And that if we were really irritated with them, we would prohibit any vessels from their country for ever competing for a license again. And the company came in and paid all the fines and said, we'd also like to tell you there was another vessel fishing illegally, and you didn't catch it, but we'd like to pay you for that one as well, because we don't want you to throw us out of the fishery for the next year. $500,000 in fine was cheap compared to actually being able to participate in the future. And it was really cheap because shortly after that, Argentina caught a vessel and they took the crew off and sank it. And so, which they had the right to do. It was an all foreign vessel. It was in their zone. This is not in the Argentinian zone. But they had the ability to say participation is strictly dependent upon adhering to the rules. Well, you'll never do that in a domestic fishery. You'll never have that kind of power. So you have to find some way to make those incentives work. Well, you also have to think about the fact that you're never going to know precisely how much you can harvest from any particular resource. And there's been an extraordinary amount of work in fisheries science to try to describe the uncertainty in estimates of parameters such as what's the acceptable biological catch level for a stock. And the difficulty with that is that there's always a push for greater precision, and that push is because you want to get closer and closer to the actual limit that you could possibly allow for fishing on a stock. And we sometimes forget that stocks have differing vulnerabilities. In other words, that there's a differing consequence for overfishing a stock that might be highly vulnerable because of its life history, something Ram worked on, versus one that is not very vulnerable. And so as you consider how are you going to set acceptable catch limits, you actually do have to think in detail about what's the vulnerability of each of the stocks that's in the mix that you're looking at in the ecosystem broadly. Whoops. Boris and others, many others, have considered that question in some detail and shown, again, looking across a very broad spectrum of information, that as you lose components of an ecosystem or biodiversity, you also lose the services from that ecosystem. And services in this case means the things that actually support human well-being that we extract from ocean ecosystems or marine ecosystems generally. And if the system is compromised, then you lose some of those services. And it's not just because we would like them to be there. Sorry, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. But because many of the services that we extract from ecosystems are absolutely critical to support of human societies. And that's not just fish resources, it's also medicines or other natural products, it's recreational tourism, it's shoreline protection, and so on. And it includes moderation of climate. So we're now seeing potential undermining of ecosystems, which will affect actually climate moderation. And that's of enormous concern. But we've tended to only look at one service at a time. Well, let's go manage fisheries over here and assume that shoreline protection or recreation and tourism will be managed separately, or energy production. And I'm skipping forward. We also know that we've got a lot of changing uses in the ocean, including energy infrastructure, as shown here, or aquaculture, that's also shown in the upper graph, and certainly wastewater disposal that's in the middle. We know that those services are something that we can't actually live without, even though we manage them as if they're separate entities, things that we don't concern one another. Well, fisheries managers, you're over there, and water quality managers, you're over there, and you don't actually need to meet in the middle. But in fact, we know you do need to meet in the middle. And in fact, if you were to look at a set of services and set of management, for each service, you're going to have impacts from lots of human activities, fishing, coastal zone management, water quality, and so on. All of those things will affect each service. So somehow you have to connect up the management, and that's a very difficult thing to do. It's hard enough to argue with fishermen. You can even be hung in effigy for it. But you actually have to broaden that debate out to a broader community and a broader set of people, a broader set of interests. And that's a concept called ecosystem-based management, and I'm hoping I've got the right slide here. And that effectively means that you try to integrate management across different human activities. You try to think about that ocean ecosystem in a more holistic way. Because if that ecosystem is not healthy, you'll start to lose services, and you might lose them at a rapid rate. Now, fisheries is an odd activity. It's highly regulated, and the science on it is rather extensive, even though highly criticized. But if you look at many of the other activities that we try to manage, like coastal zone development, it's far more poorly understood, what the impacts are certainly, and often more poorly regulated. And so this challenge of integrating across human activities is a very substantial one. So let's go back then to the lessons learned and remember that there is a false dichotomy between environmental changes and fishing effects, but there's also a false dichotomy between fishing effects and effects of other human activities. You can't say, oh, it's only fishing that matters for habitat. For example, salmon on the west coast of North America is affected by fishing, but it's certainly affected by habitat loss. And separating those out doesn't make a lot of sense. You can't do a management plan for one and then go away and say, I've done my job. You know, as it's not only fisheries that will adapt incredibly quickly as species composition changes, ranges change, and productivity change due to things such as climate effects. It also will be other human activities. So those other human activities can be certainly recreation, which is changing almost as rapidly as fisheries does. They can be energy resources, such as putting fixed structures in the ocean for wind farms or LNG ports or wave generation or tidal generators. Those things will also change very rapidly as ecosystem conditions change. Might not be species composition, but it certainly is ecosystem conditions. And if we imagine that our way to address that is just by continuing to reduce, we're going to catch up to the technology changes and we'll just be one step behind and regulate it once it occurs, then we probably will fail. Well, what does that mean that you have to do instead? It almost certainly means that you have to sort of develop an ocean plan ahead and say, okay, what are the kinds of things that would occur and what are the impacts that we would accept, regardless of what those technological changes might be. So I'm currently involved in an effort in Massachusetts to develop a Massachusetts ocean plan for the state waters of Massachusetts. There's a Canada Oceans Act which calls for planning in Canadian waters too. The question is, what are the standards by which we should decide an activity or an impact level is acceptable in any given marine ecosystem? Because unless you choose a set of standards of acceptable level of impact, as opposed to just saying we should be careful, then you actually won't be able to manage or make decisions about whether a fishing activity is acceptable, siting of an energy facility is acceptable, water quality issues are acceptable. You have to come up with a set of standards that you continually test things against. And that hasn't occurred for marine ecosystems broadly. So certainly for the students who are here, that would be a question that RAM would be happy to ask. What's an acceptable level of impact? And maybe in your careers you'll figure out what the answer to that is. I will leave you with a quote from one of my recent favorite mystery novels by a guy named Robert Wilson. And it's about a detective in Spain. And hopefully you can see that, but the main point is that being a homicide detective isn't really that much of a problem. It's pretty easy, actually, to solve most of the murders, and there's not that many. And that gives me an illusion that problems are being resolved. If I were trying to resolve something like global warming or the ocean's dwindling fish stocks, I'd probably be in much worse mental shape. And so that's a lesson to all of us. Be a detective, not a graduate student. But I want to close with thanking you for your attention. I rambled a little bit, and I apologize for that. It was hard to figure out what to say and what to cover in a talk honoring somebody like Ram, who covered so many things in unfortunately far too short a time. But it is truly an honor for me to be able to speak in his honor, and I hope you will take it that way. I haven't done him justice. That's certainly the case, but I've enjoyed at least trying to share some thoughts with you about ocean management. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think, given the nature of the topic and the size of the audience, Andy's agreed to entertain 2 or 3 questions. If people have questions, we'd ask you to come down to one of the 2 microphones just to ensure that everyone can hear the question. But if there are any questions emerging from his lecture, more than happy to take them.
Now just remember, there's not a seminar I ever saw Ram sit in where he didn't ask a question, even if he hated the seminar.
Lindy?
I'm just wondering how practical it is to actually assess cumulative impacts. If you think about, the many natures of impacts, and I'm just wondering, for their own work, my own work, is it better just to focus on actually managing for cumulative impacts without knowing exactly how they all interact, and just sort of in a way, I guess I'm thinking more of marine protected areas here, where you just, don't try to bother with the interactions. You just say this area will be free of impacts, or how reasonable. I mean, how much emphasis should we be putting on actual assessment?
This is a really important question, because we often try to evaluate things like impacts, whether it be on a fish stock or on an ecosystem or in any other setting, to a much higher level of precision that might actually matter for management. It's not the precision that matters, it's the direction in many cases, or the relative weighting. So my sense is that in measuring cumulative impacts, you want to know whether cumulative impacts have reached some categorical threshold, as opposed to precisely can we measure those impacts relative to a reference point. There certainly are measures like marine protected areas that are going to be sensible in almost every circumstance. The problem is, from a policy perspective, citing one is an allocation between users. It's not that people would disagree with the protections, it's they would disagree whether they should be the ones affected by the protections as opposed to some other group. And so, in general, it's very sensible to propose protection measures, even if you don't know the impacts very well, but the politics of creating those measures is very difficult.
I was wondering if you have some advice, having sat on both sides of the bench, on how best can scientists and policymakers, in our instance it will be obviously fisheries and oceans versus perhaps university researchers, to talk to one another. How do you get the science to work for the management?
Again, a very interesting question, and a long answer is more appropriate than a short answer. But, I mean, the first part of it is actually understanding that both jobs are incredibly difficult and have their own unique constraints. So when I moved to the policy office from the Science Center, I actually, had a number of my scientist colleagues say, why would you want to do that? Those people, they just sort of fold and staple paper all day. That's their job. And, there's some mutual appreciation of what's the question that a policymaker actually needs to help in answering, as opposed to what's the analysis you'd like to do. And from the other side, what's a reasonable question to ask? And so I would say that scientists should help policymakers ask reasonable questions, and policymakers should help scientists understand the questions that they need to answer in order to take the next step forward. It's inevitably a frustrating process. I mean, and it's not frustrating because, people are good, bad, or indifferent. It's because there's real people's lives involved. And so the decisions are very difficult ones. But you only make that progress between science and policy by sort of deciding, how do you ask questions appropriately? What really matters here? And then how well do you need to know the answer? You might want to know the answer very precisely in a scientific setting, or maybe you need it very imprecisely in a scientific setting, and vice versa in a policy setting.
Move over to the microphone, please, Bill.
You've spoken of integrated coastal zone management and ecosystem management. And yet, when you talk of policymakers, you speak of them as if there is one room full of policymakers. One of the big obstacles to all of these integrated approaches has been that the use of the ocean is typically divided among many different policy-making organizations. You have a Department of Fisheries, a Department of Transport, Department of the Environment, and so on. And in most cases, these departments don't work together. Attempts to make them work together normally lead to turf battles rather than progress. What do you think are the realistic prospects, and what are the mechanisms, perhaps is more to the point, for actually getting the kinds of governments that we're familiar with? You could speak about the US or Canadian government or the EU, to actually take an integrated approach of the kind that you're advocating?
Well, again, a good question that deserves a long answer, and I need to give a short answer. But first of all, I would be wary of assigning everything to turf battles, because scientists are almost as good at turf battles as policymakers are, as far as I can tell, and have experienced. Certainly, those kinds of battles occur because everyone is trying to stay within a manageable job setting. Perhaps more important, what is it that you do in a governance framework that creates an atmosphere where you would cross the lines? And I think you focus on two things and don't focus on the third. You focus on goals for an ecosystem more broadly, which is a principle for ecosystem management, and you focus on general strategy that you would like the sectors to adopt in order to meet those goals, and you leave the tactics to each of the management agencies very clearly. You don't need a broader set of people arguing over the fishery management rules. You need that broader set of people to help formulate the objectives, if you like, goals and strategies that relate to an ecosystem more broadly. And you have to do that in the context of having an actual legal mandate to do so that has standards in it that can be enforced. If you don't, there's no reason to imagine that people will just change the way they do business in a policy setting, or for that matter, in many cases, in a science setting. I mean, in many assessment settings, fisheries assessment settings, people don't want to do a different kind of assessment. They want to do the things that they're used to doing and continue to make the incremental advances that they make. And so you have to set up a different governance framework to do this, and then focus the planning activities on goals and strategies, and not imagine that you're going to dictate a set of tactics that's going to flow down to every one of the sectors. Now, that's still an enormous challenge. Doesn't mean you can't do it, because people would say you couldn't do fisheries management at some point, and we know you can, even though it's difficult and is certainly far from successful in many cases.
Landy, maybe I'll take the prerogative of asking one quick question that ties in a couple of things. Shifting baselines, policy, and historical ecology. The Marine Stewardship Council in the UK recently gave Canada its first green certification, the first certified fishery, and that was for northern shrimp off of Labrador. The irony behind that is the only reason shrimp are doing so well right now is because we overexploited cod to such low levels. So we've got a shifting baseline issue there. Currently, your wonderful slide showing the masses of cod that once existed in the past are really quite striking, but I do wonder about the degree to which those types of slides, while they're very impressive to us and we feel that loss, does it matter to policymakers? Does that sort of historical extent of decline have a meaningful, does it meaningfully influence policy, do you think?
The short answer to that is yes, I think it does. And the reason that I think it does is because of experience in developing rebuilding plans, where the initial reaction was, well, you could never rebuild to what seemed to me to be incredibly modest level of abundance in the scallop fishery or the haddock fishery in New England. And then realizing that, of course, the system had been far more productive in the past, and when you had exceeded the initial rebuilding target, people said, that's enough, now we can go back to fishing the way that we were. But it gave you perspective to say there's other options out here. The system could be very much more productive. Now, nobody, I would say, thinks that you're going to rebuild the cod stock or any other resource to the level it was in the 19th century. What you're trying to do, it seems to me, is to open up the possibilities that there might be other configurations. Marine Stewardship Council, I can understand why they would end up with that result, because they're only looking at the present. So it is a shifting baseline for them in the way that their standards are written. And I'm not sure that you could actually make the Marine Stewardship Council system work if you put very much historical perspective on it. Maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. But in an actual management context, it can be very powerful. Because the interesting thing about historical ecology is everyone is interested in their history. And so they take those messages away much more easily than they do, the most recent estimate from the stock assessment. Trust me.
I can see that. Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you for the questions. I'd now like to call upon Ram's wife, Rita Kindle-Myers, who'd like to make a presentation to Andy. Rita?
Andy, I wanted to extend a personal thank you, and as well a thank you on behalf of the university, Dalhousie University. We have commissioned a painting to give to you by a local artist. She's actually here, Gillian Boyce. She's a student at NASCAD University, and we just... Yeah. Yes, you can.
For those my friend. And your love, Graham. Thank you very much.